Welcome to Rock Reads 2, this is the second year that we're doing a conversation for the Easton Book Festival featuring musicians. Tonight we have Chris Cummings, Shane Nicholas, and Jason Hedrington. And basically we're talking about books where, the idea here is to give another side, to look at what artists not only are reading, but maybe what has influenced either their careers, their playing, their love of music. So in the book festival, we talk a lot about our love of books and our love of the arts and supporting the arts. So the idea came up last year, since we were virtual, to have a conversation with musicians on books. So that's where Rock Reads really was born. So what I'm going to do is give a couple of minutes for our guests to each introduce themselves, starting with Chris.
Hey, thanks. And thanks for hosting this, Lynn. I really appreciate being here, especially with these guys and with you. My name's Chris Cummings. I'm a drummer, educator, producer, composer. I've been living here in the Lehigh Valley for most of my adult life. And basically, as far as my projects are concerned, there's not a lot of people around here I don't seem to play with these days. For the last 7 years, the focus has mainly been on the Dave Goddess group and our record out right now, Back in Business, which is actually kind of doing well. And then I'm also involved with Lisa Bodner and Whistlegrass. And then there's the Chris Cummings trio, as well as my teaching and recording activities. I do both those things right here, and end up anywhere doing from 20 to 30 records a year for people right here in my studio. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I've been living in the Valley here for a long time. I'm married with 4 kids. I read basically every day. It's part of kind of my ritual to start every day. And I'm really happy to be here and be sharing especially with you folks.
Thank you so much. Let's move on to Shane. Shane, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shane Nicholas. I grew up in farm country, a little bit northwest of Allentown, PA. I worked with Chris in retail in Allentown for probably 10 years, and then moved to Arizona to take a job at Fender Musical Instruments. Nice. I just retired this year after working there for 25 years. Lifelong guitar player, singer. Used to write songs when I was younger. When you get older and happier, a lot of that goes away. But we're here today to talk about reading, and being that I did grow up kind of in a very rural situation, my nearest friend was a 20-minute bicycle ride away. So I read voraciously starting under the age of 10, and a lot of what I know about the industry of musical instruments, which I've fed my family my entire adult life on, is because I could read Guitar Player magazine. I could read Tom Wheeler's guitar books. I could read biographies of the Beatles and the Stones and so on. And that was such a great part of my childhood and my teen years, so that when I did finally get to the point where I was meeting all kinds of musicians from all kinds of different walks of life, I had a great vocabulary. And then finally, I didn't just read music books. I've read novels and nonfiction, and I used to sit and read the encyclopedia when I was a kid. Again, just being starved for information. And I have a 30-year-old son who doesn't remember what it was like to not be able to look stuff up on the internet, but I sure do remember that.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I'm really happy to participate. I have very deep roots in the state of PA, and visit often, and glad to be a part of this.
Well, thank you very much, and we hope that we'll get together at some point when you come to Pennsylvania. It would be good to do this in person, in the future. So Jason, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Jason Hedrington, also a local musician. I'm a Wisconsin transplant, moved here in '97. I forget the math, but I think I'm officially at the point now where over half my life has been in the Lehigh Valley. So I'm pretty much a Pennsylvania now. I'm still Wisconsinite at heart. That's still home. But yeah, I've been playing locally since I got here. My college songwriting partner moved out here with me. We started a band right away. So I've been in and out of countless bands, and currently am focusing now. We were talking before, COVID kind of helped where I finally sort of allowed myself to just be myself instead of trying to do too many other projects. So for about 3 years now, it's been nothing but just working on my Head Eye project, where just today I just came running to the Zoom meeting after a recording session today that included also training some young up-and-coming young producers who've been hanging out at the studio. So I just got my hands in a lot of stuff locally, including teaching at the School of Rock. I'm a keyboard, vocal, and beginning guitar. There's a point where I have to hand them off to the shredders, but teaching, and I also direct 2 bands in the performance group at the School of Rock. So my sort of special connection to books, I also grew up an avid reader. For me, it was reading and writing before I was even a musician. I actually, fun fact, have an English degree. So I actually went to college and got an English degree and thought I might be an English teacher. Things went a different way, apparently. And now I'm still a teacher. I'm a music teacher instead. But there was a time where I thought I would actually be a writer and more in the writing and sort of publishing world, and just went into the music instead. Like I was in the book clubs when I was growing up, the summer library reading clubs, all that stuff. So original musician as well. So my 2 worlds definitely blend a lot between blogging and writing songs, working on memoirs. So I'm definitely still to this day, I think, balancing out my love for reading and writing with my love for music. I think at one point it took me many, many years to get over that idea that I could be a professional musician, because I was definitely one of those guys who Mother Culture, as Daniel Quinn said, was whispering in my ear that you can't be a professional musician. So I was definitely more in the writing world for a long time, because that also was very easy to get a career in, to be a professional writer. So I left the illustrious English world behind for the illustrious money-making world of the professional musician. And here I am.
There you have it. All right.
Thank you guys so much. So thank you for the introductions and for sharing a little bit about yourselves. One of the things that we have coming up is a band book event. We're actually doing a panel as part of the festival. And, I said that I didn't have a lot of questions prepared. I wanted to kind of be a little more free flowing. But since this came up, in fairness, since this came up earlier, one of the things when I think about censorship and I think about our right to, how important information, books, reading, but just the arts, how important freedom is. I can't help but start off with, Frank Zappa, so basically hold it up if you got it. So I thought that maybe how about
that's all upstairs. Now I have shame. I have shame.
No, but I kind of suspected that the 3 of you, maybe not necessarily have it yet, but people like that. People who are, to sort of start the conversation. One of the things that I'm interested in is just, the way that freedom and the right to express ourselves, how sometimes that is, something that is in jeopardy. You wouldn't think so, but sadly it is. And we've, many of us are old enough to have lived through banned books and censorship, and we continue to this day. We still are dealing with that. We're still dealing with people trying to control what we read, what we see, what we listen to. There was a time where, and you guys all know this too, where people were controlling music as well, so I guess, sort of in a freewheeling kind of way, I thought to start the conversation going and see what directions it goes into, but maybe to talk a little bit about the commonality between controlling music, controlling books, controlling the arts, and how that ties into basically books, into musicians and reading. I want to sort of start with you, Jason, because you were the first to hold it up. So, but everybody kind of jump in. You know how this works. So,
yeah. Well, my first thought that pops out at me is I think the big thing that I've noticed lately when I hear of new books popping up on the list and new artists who are being banned or censored, the pattern that I see is it's just people who have dangerous ideas, and those dangerous ideas usually end up being speaking truth to power. It's not that I think they're saying anything particularly controversial, but those seem to be the ones I keep noticing it's the people who are maybe challenging the status quo. They're challenging the system. It's not that they're being banned because they swear too much in their book, or they're not being banned. I mean, quite frankly, they're not being banned because they have titillating things in their books, because obviously porn is readily available. It's usually more dangerous ideas that seems to me to be the commonality right now. Is, again, opening up all these cans of worms. There seems to be a power structure that's trying to really tighten down on the status quo and on that control of folks, and any little piece of information that's trying to break through that to make people freer thinkers that they might challenge the system. That seems to me to be the most at risk information and art that we have right now, and it's the most important art, to throw that out there.
That's good points there. When Lynn said banned books, the very first thing that popped into my mind was Fahrenheit 351 by Ray Bradbury. Yeah. And obviously we don't want this little chat to get too political here, but if you've read a book like that, if you've read Brave New World, if you've watched documentaries about World War II, if the more you enrich your that part of your brain about stuff that happened in reality. I mean, obviously the first two books I mentioned were novels, but still there were people banning books and, putting Jews in the concentration camps and stuff.
Themes.
Every now and then on the news today, you'll see something that's like, wow, they're trying to remove a whole bunch of books from a high school in Florida. I can't believe that, 50 years after some of us read some of those books, that people are still trying to do that. It's just mind-blowing to me. The more you've read, and the more you're not going to fall for that stuff.
Yeah, and to that end, and let's tie it back to the PMRC that we all remember in the '80s and all that kind of business that was going down. What was that really all about? When I reflect on that now at this point in my life, what I think that's about is all about appearances. That idea of we're going to keep you safe, which is a common running theme among certain organizations. Safe from your own thoughts, from your own ideas, or having others interject their thoughts or ideas on you. And I don't necessarily know that that's necessarily a new thing. I mean, we could want to talk about books, we can go back to the Council of Nicaea and talk about all the books that were wiped out of the Bible, right? So, it's more people just trying to control things, for their own gain. And what's the value of that? And talking about books, in schools, as my former gig as a PTA president, it's disheartening when you learn that, basically most of the textbooks that children get in their schools are dictated out of 2 districts that are located in Texas. All right. So, we have different kinds of censorship, is I guess why I bring that up, that exists, which is much more pervasive, really,
We were taught in school that Columbus discovered America.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
And I've extensively toured ghost towns and Indian ruins and stuff in Arizona, and every now and then I'll go somewhere and then you read about it and it's like, oh yeah, the Hohokam Indians were here in AD 1000 to 1200 or whatever. So there were millions of people here before he showed up, but that's what we were taught at school.
Right. Yeah. Right. No doubt.
And I think a really interesting point you made there, Chris, as well, was I like that keeping up appearances idea, because I know one thing that when I've been doing, just trying to stay, it drives me crazy to stay involved in what's going on out there in politics, but then when I'll put it away for a while and it'll pop back up. And one thing that has been a theme that I've heard from a lot of pundits and even people on both sides, including some whistleblower Republicans who aren't afraid to speak out, is this idea of this movement of people who say things that they know they don't believe it. So like, for instance, a lot of the people who might, be supporting the fake election, all that stuff, all these things. And again, we don't want to get too political right away, but you can't avoid it. It's all pervasive. But this idea that there are people that they literally believe one thing and they know something to be false and they know something's complete BS, but to keep up the appearances and to stay in the club, they're going to talk to America like there's this whole other truth. It's not the truth. And I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up of just, is it really censorship because it needs to happen, or because they're just trying to keep up some silly appearance that they think it's going to win them votes?
Well, it's George Orwell's doublespeak.
There you have it.
Amen.
Boom.
He was talking about, when did he write that? Like 1940 something?
Yeah.
48. Yeah.
Obviously very much influenced by what was going on in World War II and that stuff. But
Sure.
it's like you said, it's nothing new. In the 80s, it happened to be rock music. And in some other decade, it was something else that people were trying to just put the thumb on the people that weren't, marching in line.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Yeah. So knowing all of that, let me ask you this, Jason. I'll throw this one at you. How does that change how you write right now? Knowing all that.
That's a great question. And there are a couple of songs that I know there's one that's already been written. I played it for a while, and it's been a while since I played out because I've been hiding in my studio here, but where I have tried to address some of these things. I will say that there's a certain type of stuff I usually write about, but I feel like this time we live in, it's like a call to arms in a lot of way. And I find myself actually having this duty to where I try to be conscious to say that there's certain things that just I need to make some sort of statement about this. And then, of course, then the whole art comes into, like, how do you say this in some sort of artistic and not dogmatic way? And that's where the art comes into it. But I forget exactly what your question was, but I do think there's
how it influences how you write. That's all,
Yeah. And that's the influence. I think it can't help but influence it somehow. I know I feel that call, definitely. What can we do? So as artists, if there's one power we have as artists and writers, it's to write about it and try to put that in, get that out there in our art. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you guys are both teaching kids, which is great. Like, you mentioned School of Rock earlier. That the fact that, our arts and music has, mostly disappeared from public schools in America is a damn shame. I might not be sitting here if I didn't have a music teacher who kind of took a liking to me and helped me out a little bit, Yeah. So to the point of how does it influence you, you're also helping to pass your passion and your sense of freedom and creativity onto a new generation of kids.
I do feel that's true. I appreciate that. And I will say, I could go big on this as well, but one thing a great hope I have is that unlike, there's that stereotypical, the older generation's always mad at the younger generation. Oh, things were better and you don't know what's going on. But I really look at these kids, and maybe I'm just blessed because I have artsy kids. I'm trying not to forget that I'm not in touch with every kid that's out there, but the kids that come through the school, man, they really give me a lot of hope for the future. And in a lot of ways, I see myself, I'm like, dude, here's the baton. Like, I feel like you kids really got a lot of this figured out. Like, for instance, one of my favorite stories is probably 4 or 5 years ago, there's this one young lady, I forget what the song was, but the subject of racism came up in the song. And I took that moment to talk to her. I was like, what do you feel about this? And, how do you feel about race? And she was actually sort of aghast for a moment that it was even an issue. And she said this quote to me, granted, out of the mouth of babe, she was probably 14, but she was like, oh yeah, that's like an old person problem. Like, that's what a lot of these young kids, coming up, I hope they stay on that path, and I'll do my best to keep them on that path. But I do, because to me, we can keep fighting the good fight and we can make our art, but really that the answer is in making sure that the next generations coming up stay on the right path. Because in a lot of ways, I mean, I won't call anybody out, but I think we're all roughly the same age, and I think our time's coming to an end, right? It's time to pass that baton on and say, this world is yours now, man. Let's have at it. And I do have faith in them. I think there's a lot of really good kids coming up. These, as much as there's the millennials and Zoomers versus Boomers thing, but I really do think they've got a lot of good ideas. And it amazes me to think, like, when I grew up, you didn't know who the gay kid was in school. And if you did know, that person was, it was a problem. You were ridiculed, or, oh, that's the gay guy. And now, like in the school, it is so open and not even an issue with these kids. They're completely open about it, and they've got like no problem with it. So, yeah, I really think I appreciate you saying that, Shane. I think that is a really big key, is getting in touch with the youth and letting them take over and do the right thing.
Yeah, and to circle back about the whole censorship idea, I think what I want to touch on is, think about what would have happened if, because what excites me is when there's new music that's released that makes kids want to play. And I think for all of us, the things that I could point to, okay, of course we could all point at the Beatles, right? We could all point at that. Anyone who hears that for the first time, it's just like, oh my God, it's magic. All right. But could you think about, say, Axis Bold of Love being censored, or Van Halen 1 being censored, or In Utero being censored? These things that make a lot of kids really want to play music, it would be heartbreaking. And then to your point, with the young people I interact with, Jason, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think that, for a lot of them, they see the problems, but at their own level, it's a completely different time and experience that, say, any one of us may have had. So
absolutely,
that's my story. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Good story.
And for the record, Phil, I mean, you can get as political as you want. You can, you have, free reign. But one of the,
well, I've only met Shane, but I know it's totally unlike Chris and I to get political in public. So,
well, you know what? I think that it's very hard not to, when we're talking about the way that the arts, is the vehicle. That's how we get, ideas out there. That's very often how they're shared. I know that, like, even for me, as I won't reveal my age either, but growing up, my dad exposing us to music, having instruments, having, his records, just even going through them and listening to them and having, and the same experience with books too, is I think that exposure to what you are told, is quote normal, and this is the way society behaves, and then finding out that there are people who have different ideas and different perspectives, learning about, like, the Grateful Dead, or or even later on Riot Grrrl and punk, all of those things. It's, for some people, that opens your eyes to the possibilities that there are all of these other people who feel as you do, who think as you do, as opposed to being silenced, right. Which is, one of the things that happens when, you don't have that control. So, Jason, since you mentioned the passing on of the baton and young people, and, if you can imagine when, my kids who are in their 20s now, my daughter was at School of Rock eons ago, and she's in her 20s now. But the idea of passing the baton, sometimes I know that when I was young, certain biographies, certain, about musicians, were there, and you could approach this however you like, but were there people who influenced you where you almost felt like, as a younger person, you read and you learned about their lives, and so you kind of, they passed the baton to you, essentially.
Right. Great question. I think for me, reading was definitely more for enjoyment, probably up until college, at least. Then you go to college and more ideas start to come in. But it was, for me, it was less about anybody I read that inspired me, but it was more lyrics. So through songs, there were definitely Because first of all, I was blessed in that my dad, like you were saying, Lynn, my dad grew up when rock was born. So I had all of his old 45s. He raised me on rock and roll. And my dad very faithfully was very open-minded to a lot of music. So when I was like 5, 6, 7, we're driving around in his truck and we had Pink Floyd metal cassette. So I definitely was opened up to a lot of cool music. And I think like a lot of the 60s stuff, I was definitely very drawn to a lot of the sort of flower power San Francisco stuff. So I started kind of getting my first teenager, just general idea that there was this thing that happened, this revolution. People thought a different way, and there was a different way you could live, and the hippie movement, the anti-war movement. So not any one person, but that general movement. And then I think right around that same time, actually Pink Floyd was huge for me. And so I would have to give props out to Roger Waters. I'm actually right now directing my show this season. I'm directing, on this note, I'm directing 2 shows, a Pink Floyd tribute and a tribute to the 60s. So in light of this conversation, I'm seeing there's all sorts of possibilities here in light of this conversation of ways I could go with some of the information for the kids. But yeah, Roger Waters was really big for me, even as a high schooler. So in my English class in high school, for instance, I remember when we had to do a report, I did a report on Pink Floyd Animals and had to like break down like the politics of Pink Floyd Animals. So yeah, I would say in general, that whole 60s thing, late 60s and Pink Floyd, later on, Frank Zappa. He's just going to keep coming up in the conversation. Yeah. And even to this day, I'll listen to some new Zappa track, or I'll re-listen to something I've heard 100 times, but it'll hit me in a different way, where I'm just like, that he had his finger on the pulse. Like, there's an artist who felt he had a duty to change the world and speak truth to power. So I'll say Roger Waters and Frank Zappa were probably 2 that really were big for me.
It's amazing that there aren't too many that you can point to. You know, Zappa is really unique. And then the other thing is that he didn't do drugs, because, you know, right. Everybody else who, you know, Dylan and Townsend and Waters and, you know, so many people who said a lot of brilliant shit also had a period where they were messed up. Yeah. You know, like the only one who didn't. And it's sort of sad that there aren't more like that. But he had the chops to back it up too. He wasn't sitting on a street corner in the dirt strumming a guitar. He was leading orchestras, you know?
Right.
And spending his time, you know, doing a gig, going to the hotel room, writing more, reading the paper every day. Like I think information kind of was his drug in a weird way. Like he was just gobbling information and staying informed constantly. Yeah.
In an era where it was easier to do, probably easier in the sense that with what you had to consume, it was manageable, unlike today. You know what I mean? You know, the digital revolution has really kind of destroyed that ability for us to do. And I still like paper books. Okay, here's Glyn Johns, sound man, right? For the reason that, like, I could take and I could read that book and it can go with me everywhere, and then I can close it and then I could ruminate on it. I don't think most of us are sitting here like doom scrolling all day long, you know. And to that point, back to what you were saying there, he had time to digest and process it and formulate his own thought, as opposed to having it shaped for him. And you mentioned the Zoomer Boomer and all that other stuff. What I want you to remember about all of that is a play right out of the Goebbels book, where basically, you know, all of modern marketing came from him. Regrettably, he has that whole thing with the Nazis was kind of, you know, what it was. But you know, that whole idea of like defining what a generation is or isn't. And we throw that language around. All of us throw that language around probably more than we should. You know, so
do you consider that marketing, or do you consider? I consider that. Putting people against one another and
well, but before he was involved in all of that, that was his gig. He essentially invented modern marketing.
And but I think that part of that boomer against Gen Z and all of these generations,
Oh, yeah.
I definitely think that driving that is the desire to, sort of the idea
Control.
of, turning laterally against one another instead of the real enemy, the oppressor, the people who are profiting, the people who are controlling, and getting us to be angry at generations, and each other, and I think that there is a lot of resentment between generations right now, and I think it's distracting us sometimes. Not that, I mean, this is your talk, so I don't want to, but I think that's why but I think that's why we keep talking about, young people today and how, how they don't want to work and they don't want to do all of these things. And none of that is true. None of that is true. There's less likelihood to be accepting of being exploited, perhaps. But so I wonder, when we talk about, passing the baton and generations, and, so you held up, a book, and that's obviously, what I want to get into. What we're reading now, what are some of the things that that not necessarily politically, but just things that kind of speak to maybe where you're at, mentally, emotionally, and the way that society is right now, if that kind of makes sense.
I want to hear what Shane's reading right now.
I'm reading a Bill Bryson book, of which I've read many, and this one is about 30 years old, so it's a little dated, but he writes a lot of cool, funny stories about, one of his most famous is A Walk in the Woods, where he and his buddy walked the Appalachian Trail, except they were like too old to do it, basically.
Oh no.
So
Okay.
I'll just, without telling you all what this is about, it's a road book. I love road stories, road trip, I'm built for that. I've driven across the entire United States twice in my life, and I probably will do it again pretty soon now that I'm retired. But this is the pull quote on the cover. The kind of book Steinbeck might have written if he'd traveled with David Letterman instead of Charlie the Poodle.
Oh, that's so awesome. That's so awesome.
That's great.
And also because I love Steinbeck and his travels with Charlie.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Tortilla flats and oh my God.
Required reading in American high schools.
Yes. Well, it should be. It should be. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So I want to dovetail into that then. So I'm still feeling the losses of 2020. And I've had these books on my stack for a while, and I almost couldn't read them. So I've actually been going through all of Neil Peart's books, for the last 2 months. And right now I'm on the Ghost Rider book, which was the book that he wrote after losing both his wife, his daughter first, and then his wife. And it's everything that you expect. This particular book is he's got a litany of the letters he wrote to friends and colleagues and things, as he was going on what he calls the quote healing journey. But it is, basically all of his books have been essentially traveling books, Shane, and that's why I kind of wanted to interject here. Forgive me for stepping on you if you wanted to go next.
No. That's the only one of Neil's books that I have read. And I loved it.
Master Rider was the first one, that bicycle trip across West Africa, which was fascinating. And what you see book to book there is the same thing that we saw like with the music career-wise. So, his ability to write matured, almost in the same way that his, ability to play did. And I actually was given a long time ago his last book, Far and Wide. And I had actually read that, and I read the whole thing in like 2 days. And then, he passed, and then it was like I just couldn't read the other things there. So, like I said, I'm just getting around to them, and it's really interesting. And I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that I do is I take little things out of it that I want to either research later on my own, and I don't want to use the word research inappropriately because I'm not a PhD student, or that I want to learn about more, or just ideas that inspire me in some way. You know what I mean? And I basically make little notes on. Now it's all on Google Docs, but I don't know. Do either of you guys do that?
Make notes on Google Docs?
Yeah, yeah, but based while you're reading the book, like go right out of it and say, "Oh yeah, I want to remember this later."
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm not if I know it's a book that I'm keeping, I'm not afraid to write in it.
That's
Yeah. Yeah.
If there's a word that I don't know, I look it up, and now I can look it up on my phone. I don't have to do it, in a dictionary, but I'll write the definition in there.
Yeah, you see, I would do that, except I know that I won't remember which book it was in. That's
well,
where did I read? So yeah, I was just curious.
If you look up the definition on here, then you snap a screenshot, and then a week later, when you're looking through your photos, it's like, what was that?
Yeah. There you go. What do you read, Jason?
I'm also a big screenshotter. Well, it's funny because the number one book I got here on top of just what I'm reading currently, and which will tie into a couple things here, unfortunately is going to get us back to politics a little bit. Just a little bit, but in that idea of, so first and foremost, I've had to sort of, to go back to the doom scrolling, I've had to sort of really consciously work on this lately, where I'm trying to replace my morning doom scroll time with book time. And because it used to be my every morning for decades, when I talk about being an English major and just reading all the time. And I've definitely noticed in the last couple of years, just this habit of I wasn't really reading books anymore. I was just surfing, maybe still looking up, like you said, Chris, things that interested me, but like everything was going through the phone. So I've had to like really consciously start making sure I get my hands on books again. And the one I happen to be currently reading is, I have this fascination. And so I thought it was going to be for enjoyment and fascination, and it turned into politics. But I'm reading, I think it's 2014, if I remember right. It's about a decade old. But I'm reading Lawrence Wright's Going Clear. I just have this fascination with like what that whole Scientology thing is about. I want to understand how it happens. I've watched the specials. I think this did turn into an HBO documentary, which spawned a bunch of other documentaries. I've watched a bunch of those. And so what's fascinating about this book, and it's just super well researched, if I remember, well, he's Pulitzer Prize. I don't know if this one won Pulitzer or not, but how we have documentation of this guy, right? So like it's all very, there's no mystery. We can look at everything that happened and how this all came to power and where we're at. And what I started to find, the political angle here, is as I started reading it, I was basically watching the last 4 or 5 years unfold before my eyes. The idea that this guy who led in this way through the things he did and his manipulations and flat out lies and just the things that he did, it was literally like watching Trump unfolding in front of me, just to throw the name out there and be political about it. But so again, I just find Scientology fascinating, period. But as far as suggesting a good nonfiction book about not just that, but seeing in real time how it happens, why it happens, what the playbook is for making it happen, and just seeing how it's happening all around us politically instead of religiously. This was my enjoyment reading.
Well, I think it's really all part of the same thing, isn't it? Because, we were talking about how we all love road trip stuff, travelogue. One of the great cures for ignorance is travel. And there's a quote in there somewhere, I forget who said it, but my relatives who consume, I won't say too much about this, but I have a few relatives who consume way too much Fox News, and they've never traveled anywhere. They've been to the Jersey Shore a couple times, maybe they went to Canada once, and like that's pretty much it. When I'm not trying to brag or anything, but when you've traveled internationally, when you've traveled to a whole bunch of different states, when you've seen what the Bible Belt culture is in, the South, when you've seen the liberalism of cities like Seattle and Portland.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the more you open your brain to the fact that other people have other ideas and other ways of living than the way you grew up in your small village.
Yeah.
So whether it's the book about L. Ron Hubbard or the Travels with Charlie type thing, either way, it's the idea that you open your mind to information from all different places, not just the source that's being fed to you on your feed in the morning.
Yeah. And again, I come back to that notion that I could take this thing, I could, sit there and read for an hour in the morning, close it and finish my coffee and be thinking about it and processing it, as opposed to just, that idea, like you said about, kind of getting hit with it again. So, yeah. And I agree with you on the travel thing, and it's interesting you say about the, your own little village, growing up in Monroe County, most of us never thought we'd ever see beyond Monroe County. You know what I mean? And certainly books provide us our own, our own escape from that. But it's sometimes I get sad when I think about folks who don't realize that with a little effort, you could do it. You can go out and see these other things and experience these other things. You don't have to agree with them or like them or accept them, but just knowing they're out there, I think it can have its own influence,
Absolutely. So. I think about, my dad bought me a set of encyclopedias when I was, 10 or 12. And it's like, he didn't have to do that, but he was smart enough to realize that, hey, you're going to have to do book reports and all this kind of stuff for school and blah, 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 blah. But what he didn't know is that I was looking up information on all kinds of stuff, not just something that would serve, the school project of the day. And I think if you expose your kids to the fact that you do read, I know a lot of people that don't have any books in their house.
Yeah.
And maybe they're reading books on a Kindle or an iPad or something. If they are, that's great. I know some people have transferred over to that method, but just influencing your own kids that they see you reading a book every day. It's got it. Well, at least with one of my kids, it did. My daughter is a voracious reader.
Good.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
my son's a musician, so.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that modeling, having books in the home and modeling reading is important. And I'm obviously that's one of the reasons, not to plug the festival again, but that's one of the reasons that we have the festival, is because, to continue to talk about, loving books, loving reading, having them in our homes, having access to reading. So one of the things I wanted to get into, and this will not surprise Chris, and I apologize that Cheryl wasn't able to be on here. And certainly if we can bring her in, I will do that. But I think about the fact that so many things, biographies, I'm not saying that they have not been written about women, but sometimes I'm intrigued when I read about what it was like to be a woman during a particular era, or what women had to go through in, certain industries like music. So I'm wondering if there's ever been a book or a biography, music or not, that, sort of gave you that perspective. Like, I'll just be blunt. Wow, must have been really, difficult during, to be a woman trying to make it in music and trying to, I don't know if any of you want to speak to that. I just, it's a perspective that I think is interesting to a lot of people, out there.
That's a really good point. Having grown up being a male, musician, and all my heroes were, the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and Ray Charles, and they were all mostly men. Mm-hmm. I have read books about Janis Joplin and Grace Slick and different, female artists. There just never seem to be many of them out there.
There's not.
And, and the School of Rock perspective, you can talk about how I worked at Fender for so long. We occasionally would do all kinds of demographic surveys and stuff. And the amount of females that play guitar or play music now versus like 40 years ago, it's night and day.
Yeah.
Some of that is because the whole American Idol and The Voice and that kind of thing encouraged people to give music a try, you know. But I just don't think there was that much of it available to us, or at least when I was young.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely. Yeah, certainly not when we were kids. That you'd think about the 1970s and 80s. Just say what that era is, and you'll know why.
Rock videos leap to mind.
Yeah, right.
Tony Katane on the car in Whitesnake videos.
Yeah. And that was as good as it gets, barring a Stevie Nicks, you know what I mean, and a Blondie and things like that. Yeah. There's countless. Joan Jett to me is like, a god in her own right.
I love Heart. I love Blondie. I love lots of female artists. The question was about reading about them. There wasn't that much available to us.
Yeah, you say that, Lynn, and the first thing that comes into my head is reading Katie Stanton. You know what I mean? Which is so off of the path of what we're talking about here now. But reflecting on that and the whole suffrage movement, and not that things are necessarily any better today, but the influence was there.
Right. And I ask that because, as I've shared this, probably with you, Chris, when I was a child, my father very supportive of music, in our house, and I had this idea that I wanted to be a musician. I wanted to play guitar, I wanted to play drums, and I remember looking for biographies, wanting to know more about women who rock, and of course, there was Heart, there was, I was very into, Janice Ian, for example. I was intrigued by people like that who had, just so much about their lives. And I just remember looking all the time for their stories and not really finding it. Now, obviously, we've come a long way and there's more of that, but, that is, I asked the question of you guys because, I suspect your childhood, it was very similar, where you would go to try to find some of these, or even get your circus magazine or whatever it is, and like, where are the women who rock, so I just
with the exception of the let's talk about Hit Parader and circus and all of that. You would see Pat Benatar, and you would see Wendy O, and you would see Blondie and things like that, or Chrissy Hynde, but percentage wise, it wasn't well represented, and in the, when we talk about drumming, when you think about the trade magazine, specifically Modern Drummer, which is kind of the blueprint for drum trades, or even Downbeat, let's go back further, women were not really represented at all. You know what I mean? I think it's, I don't know about you guys. I think it's still kind of, women are still underrepresented, certainly in the trade papers. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily see any women, unless if it's Dame Evelyn Glennie, for Percussive Arts Society. I don't see PAS doing necessarily, hyper focus, to kind of balance that out, So, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Do you read American Songwriter, Chris?
No, I don't. Should I?
That's like the only, I've been reading guitar magazines since 1978. So it's like I've had it up to here with guitar magazines. But American Songwriter is really great.
Yeah.
And they lean Americana, but a lot of the artists, it's like, it's someone who wrote great songs. It could be a guy, it could be a girl, they could be black, they could be and they're just treated as, we're going to do a profile of a
great songwriter.
It's a really good magazine.
Nice.
I think I have a couple thoughts, and for me, I can definitely own the fact that I was much further on in my years before I even realized how man heavy my collection was. I remember I had a friend came over when I just moved out here, and my vinyl collection was in the living room, and this woman came over, and we were talking music, and she was just scanning through my album collection, And she just turned around and smiled. And she goes, "I don't see a lot of women in here." and that was really that first moment made me go, I just never even thought about it. I never even thought about that fact. And so for me, it's been more of a journey to go back and discover, because absolutely it was the whole thing is when you go back and start looking at rock history and music history, you realize there are an equal amount of women artists, but they're not getting the spotlight. And you've got to actually do more of the digging yourself to go and discover them and find out about them. We could talk about the reasons for that, but so I've definitely had to I had to go through that discovery process myself, because everything in my collection was dudes. And the one thing I can tell you, again, with the hope in the future, whether the spotlight changes, because that's the whole conversation, is they're there, but what are we paying attention to and why? Because of what the industry is giving to us as what they're spotlighting. And I would say at the School of Rock, for instance, it's roughly half, if not more, young ladies right now. In my Pink Floyd tribute, we have 3 guitar players. It's 1 young man and 2 young ladies. In a lot of ways, the young ladies are out populating the up and coming rockers, at least in our school. Singers, 90 to 10%, it's the young ladies. Guitarists are about equal. Keyboardists, more young ladies than young men. Drummers, a few more dudes, but we've got a lot of young lady drummers. And frankly, I think more bass players are women, young ladies at our school than young dudes. So for me, the question is, again, if we laid out every artist who's ever recorded anything, it's probably equal, but we just don't know about all the women because of what the industry has helped us with in that way. So we've got to do our own research. And one thing I'll finish that thought with this story is, it's one thing that and again, I had to have my eyes open that way. And it was a couple seasons ago, my good friend and fellow teacher and director at the School of Rock, Jenny Founds, who sings in Start Making Sense and Ruby Deer locally. I was doing this Keyboard Heroes show, and I had my list of my top 100 down to 50. I was whittling down who are my top keyboard gods and heroes. And she just took me aside, and we were talking about what was going to be in the show. And she just said, "I got one question for you." She goes, "So who are your woman keyboard heroes?" And she just basically, in so many words, went, "Who are you going to have in the show, bro? You are going to represent women as well, right?" And it just made me it took me aback, because I looked at my list and I'm like, yeah, I've got Fiona, I've got Tori, I've got Kate Bush. We had this fateful thing where, because of Jenny in that conversation, I put Kate Bush running up that hill in the show, and then later the song blew up. So we actually had this very nice fateful thing where that teamwork and talking about the issue led to a very cool thing for the school, where the kids were right there at that moment when that song blew up. But again, honestly, my inclination first is just what I'm familiar with. And it takes people like my friend Jenny to say, hey, make sure you're looking at these other folks. And then I've got to take that step and get as equal of representation in there as I can. And then those ended up being some of the most fun songs, of course, too, like the Fiona Apple stuff. The Dresden Dolls, I had them in the show, and watching both the young ladies and the young men like bashing those pianos for the Dresden Dolls and Fiona Apple ended up being some of the highlights of the show, quite frankly. So again, to wrap that all up, I think it's out there. It's going to be up to us to just keep spreading that word and highlighting the important women artists, because the industry isn't doing it for us.
No, and let's be clear about why. You said, well, we could talk about why. It's one word. It's, well, maybe 2: misogyny, and bias, or gender bias. I mean, that's what it is.
The boys' club.
Mm-hmm. Right, no doubt.
Well, Chris,
no doubt.
back when we were in retail, one of our training sessions was, too many guys that work in music stores. When a female player comes in, they'll say, "Are you buying for somebody else?"
Oh yeah.
We had to unlearn. We had to unlearn that. It's like, "Oh, you're interested in a guitar? Tell me about yourself."
Right.
And it's such a subtle little difference there, but females were made to feel inferior in music stores forever.
Yep. That's
It's
true.
actually funny. I'm such a fan of the music of the 60s and 70s, but it's actually incredible how misogynistic a lot of it is when you really look at the lyrics.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
And big hit songs, that are about, she was a day tripper,
Right, right.
She broke my heart. She's a, seeing people all over town. It's I think that goes back to old blues lyrics probably.
Oh yeah, everything goes there. That's still everything, right? I get conflicted at this point at sometimes. There's some music I just don't want to play now, for those reasons. You know what I mean? So, as the father of two daughters and a more open perspective than the 14-year-old from Monroe County that I used to be, I'm at that point where I can choose to say no when I want to. You know what I mean? Which is its own sort of comfort.
There were a few people like Janis Joplin and Aretha Franklin that could turn it on its head. They could take they could change the gender role of the song, and
absolutely.
Bobby McGee is a great example of that. But it was pretty rare.
Yeah, no doubt. But again, our it was myopic. I mean, when you think about if this is the entirety of the music catalog, if we wedge the women in the middle here, it's a small amount that we were exposed to. You know what I mean? I just saw my youngest son bought me tickets to see The Who for Father's Day and to celebrate a few other things, and it was this artist named Amethyst Kia that I had never heard of opening up for them, right? And she had been opening up for a while, and I'm listening to her play and sing in these magnificent songs, and the band's tight, and she's a killer player and a great singer, and no one's ever heard of her. She's opening for one of the largest rock acts ever.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm like, why? So, but yeah, and it's not getting better. I will say we may think it's getting better, but it's not to the degree that it should be with all we know and our ability to transform things, through technology like we're doing here, which, really begs the question. I'm sorry?
It's painfully slow. It is changing.
Yeah.
Not as fast as it should be.
Yeah, and there are those that would want us to turn back the hands of time right now, which is its own, conundrum, which will throw me in a fit of rage. So I'll stop there.
Right. So since we are toward the end, we have a few minutes. What I'd like to do is maybe in the last couple of minutes, give each of you maybe a minute to recommend a book or two, just as simple as that. Is there something where, you feel like people need to read this? It could be anything. So maybe the last couple minutes, just maybe a minute on something where you think, what should we have on our shelves, in your opinion? And we'll start with the same order that we started in the beginning. Chris, Shane, then Jason.
Okay. I'm happy to do that. So I think, your recent publication is something I want these guys to read, Lynn. I've read it 3 times. Okay. Find It in the Iris by our host. And your writing is so completely striking to me. I'm like, I go back and I'm find myself reinterpreting it, and adjusting it as I go through it, and it's a magnificent piece of work, and I hope you're as proud of it as I want to be for you. So that I would say, the second Johnny Cash autobiography. And Bruce Springsteen's autobiography. And why those is because they read like prose. You know what I mean? They read like you hear their songs. Okay. Beyond that, people should. Yes, that's it. Yep. Beyond that, I would say, some of the other, things that everyone should have read in high school, but probably didn't. Fahrenheit 451. I think everyone should read Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, and Tortilla Flats. I think, Holden Caulfield, help me here, Catcher in the Rye, Brave New World, and the list goes on and on. There were reasons that people wanted us to read those books. And, even go back to weirder stuff, like Ivanhoe and, Sir Walter Scott and, the Tolkien stuff. My children brought me the joy of the Tolkien stuff. I did not dig any of that when I was a kid, but now I get it, So that's enough of my pontificating. So that's my story.
Thank you, Shane. What should be on our shelves?
Well, I think about 90% of what Chris just mentioned I have read. Steinbeck being at or near the top of my list. Just fantastic. I'll go totally left field though. Travel books. My favorites are The Lonely Planet. And you can read the section of the book that's about Seattle or about Portland or whatever, Washington, D.C., whatever city you're going to. And you can feel like you get there and rent a car or get on a public transit and like you own the place. And that's only because you sit there with an actual paper book and go, oh, wow, this looks interesting. Oh, there's a restaurant that does small plates, whatever it is. The caveat being they get outdated pretty quick. National parks and stuff don't get outdated, but cities and restaurants and hotels and stuff do. But I have been all over the United States and all over the world with one of these books in my backpack, and it has just enriched my life beyond belief.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
So awesome. I would say for people who don't know this, the Lonely Planet series, pick a city, pick a country, pick a state, buy the book. It's
Boom. That's awesome. Yeah, I never knew that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I never knew that. Yeah.
Tolkien, you mentioned. I read The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings as a teenager, and again in my 20s, and again in my 30s. And it's pretty amazing how your perspective completely changes. Because when I was a teenager, I wanted to get past the boring stuff as quick as possible to get to the next battle or the next invasion or whatever. When I read it in my 30s, I was like, oh my God, there's a subtlety of dialogue and a whole tit for tat thing that's going on between these two characters that are talking that you don't pick up when you're a teenager.
No doubt. Yeah, and it's that way with music. I mean, you and I have even talked about this before, like listening to stuff now, versus, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, you're getting a different thing. It's just like a child who has a toy at 5 and that toy happens to be in the room still when they're 8. Their perspective on that thing is completely different now, and they perceive it different. And I think, both literature and music work the same way. It's no different.
I have certain books that I reread again and again and again. I'm give them a break for a little while, but one more, and then I'm going to pass the baton. My favorite outdoor writer, Edward Abbey.
Nice.
Have any of you guys read Desert Solitaire?
No, is that all right?
It's obviously more well known in the desert, but he's funny. It's a little outdated, and it was written in the 70s. But Edward Abbey, check him out. He also has he wrote a book, also a famous book, a novel called The Monkey Wrench Gang, which is about eco-terrorism. But I will stop there.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Shane. So, Jason, you have the last word and the last recommendation.
Woo! All right. Well, first, I'll follow up on that whole Tolkien thing with, I think someone mentioned earlier the classic Catcher in the Rye, and I bring that up from that perspective of noticing your own growth, right? It's such a great classic because, again, when you're young, it's Holden is the coolest guy ever. Then you read it in your 20s and you're like, okay, I understand he's a troubled kid, whatever. And then you get older and you're like, he's a real moron. What's his problem?
Yeah.
I just love that idea of how the book can evolve with you as you evolve. So I just wanted to follow up on that. Other than that, I had it, when we were talking about how I'm trying to get more into the reading and less of the scrolling. I have three main piles. We already covered Frank Zappa, so for my musicians out there, the Frank Zappa book. I'm just going to blast a couple things at you. I also had the blessing of my producer friend John Paul. Thank you, John Paul. Got me some lessons with Mike Garcon, and so I did some Zoom lessons with him. So Bowie's Piano Man, a great look at behind the scenes of a name that not a lot of folks outside the industry are familiar with, but this guy was with Bowie for many years, did some songwriting with him. Great dude. Highly recommend the Bowie's Piano Man. And then for in my music pile, I'm a huge fish head. I got the bandana on. So for kids coming up trying to learn how to jam and communicate as musicians, like my two big go-tos, I said, tell them to pick up the Fish book, because in this book, there's a lot of stuff that Trey talks about, is like how the band actually learned how, like they would do in their practices, not just learning songs, but their jam drills and their improvisation drills. And I think for a modern band, there's a lot of good stuff in there. I mentioned this last time. I always say my number one musician book is Effortless Mastery by Kenny Werner, that every musician has to have, if for no other reason. I said this last time, but I'm going to say it again. The mantra of you're not supposed to sound like anybody else. Your job as a musician is to be you. You are not Keith Emerson, and Keith Emerson is not you. Like, your job as an artist is to be 100% authentically yourself. And I think that's the big thing I took out of Kenny Werner's Effortless Mastery. Other than that, I'll end with this. The other big thing that I've got is just my pile of gardening books.
Nice.
So I got this, I got the Living on a Few Acres. I got involved in Rodale when I first moved out here. I discovered I had a friend that worked there. And so I've got just books and books of all the organic gardening stuff. My latest one is I'm learning how to be a better pruner and just like get my plants to grow a little better. But besides my music and my writing, I really find that what's been really, for me, the yard has become, the last few years, part of my art. And especially with the perennials and native gardening, I'm a big proponent of finding the plants that grow in your native area for your native pollinators and all that sort of stuff. So I go out in the yard now, and I don't paint, but I sort of paint the yard, and I plant in a way that will create my little environment back there. And I just think I can't, if you haven't done any gardening, even if you just get a couple pots, if you get a 5x5 plot in your backyard, I find like there's just no more peace that I find in this life than just like going out there in the garden, digging in the earth a little bit, watching something you planted grow. And I think there could be something to be said for, the times we live in. Knowing how to grow some food would not be the worst idea in the world. So gardening books. Yeah. And Rodale's a great local resource. So
yeah. That's awesome.
So much. So thank you. This was Rock Reads. It's something that I'm hoping to do every year. Thank you to Chris Cummings, Shane Nicholas, and Jason Hedrington. And thank you for watching.
Thanks for having us, Lynn.
Nice to meet you, Shane. Good to see you, Chris. Good to see you,
Thanks,
Lynn.
everybody.
Good to see you, Shane. Good seeing you, my friend. See you, Jason. Too. Lynn, talk to you soon.